Hello and welcome to BungaCast, the global politics podcast at the end of history. This week's episode concerns the Sahel, the semi-arid region south of the Sahara, and the conflicts ongoing there, in particular in Mali. I'll pass over now to Philip Cunliffe, who is speaking to Yvan Guichaou.
So we're recording on the 11th of November, and today I'm delighted to be joined by a former colleague of mine from the University of Kent, Yvan Guichaoua, who is Senior Lecturer in Conflict Analysis at the Brussels Schools of International Studies, which is part of the University of Kent, but at the Brussels campus. So my old University of Kent, has two campuses. I was based at the Canterbury campus, and my colleague Yvan is based at the Brussels campus. And today we've got Yvan on to talk about a topic which I've been meaning to discuss for a long time, which is the course of the war on terror and the French military intervention in Francophone Africa and Northwest Africa, particularly in Mali, but it's embroiled in a whole complex of conflicts in the region, which we'll talk about with Yvan shortly. But it's a conflict that's been overlooked, especially in the Anglophone press. Occasionally it breaks through to the surface with pieces in the New York Times and the Guardian and the Financial Times, but even in those places, generally it's not received the kind of attention that the sheer kind of scale and complexity of the conflict warrants, perhaps. So for that reason, I'm delighted to be joined by Yvan to talk about this topic. And Yvan also has a number of academic articles out on this, which interested listeners can follow up. You can find them in the show notes. One is a piece on the French intervention in Mali, published in International Affairs, and the other one concerns norms and jihadi violence, and that's published in International Interactions. And like I say, you can find the links on for those pieces in the show notes. So welcome to the show, Yvan.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm glad to be here.
So before we get into the topic, could you tell us a little bit about how you came to study the Sahel? What interested you about this region originally?
Well, I started working on the Sahel in 2007, and my first entry point into the political dynamics in the Sahel was the rebellion that was happening there in 2007. Now, ironically, I was not meant to work on this particular Tuareg rebellion that started in 2007. I was willing to work on a previous rebellion that happened in the 90s. And my original intention was actually to talk to veterans of this rebellion and to study the post-conflict situation and whether the grievances of these combatants had been addressed or not. But the most perhaps important reason for this was that just before that, I was a postdoctoral student at the University of Kent. I was working on Nigeria and particularly the ethnic militias operating in Nigeria. And I found it really, really tough to work in this context. And I had conversations with a scholar I really
Sorry,
like.
when you say tough, do you mean tough to do field work, or do you mean just the kind of the background and the analytical kind of issues?
Well, it was analytically challenging, but it was particularly challenging as far as data collection and fieldwork were concerned.
Yeah.
The whole environment was causing quite a lot of psychological distress, I have to be honest.
Yeah.
I felt very isolated, very vulnerable, working with these ethnic militias. Like I was meeting them on a regular basis, and everything that was happening inside the groups, outside the groups, in the broader political environment, were making me feel pretty bad, in fact. And so I had conversations, I remember, with Stathis Kalivas, who is a wonderful scholar of conflict, who told me at the time, look, what's the point of studying an ongoing conflict? And there's in fact plenty you can achieve by looking at a past conflict. And it may sound silly retrospectively, but it didn't occur to me that it was actually interesting to also study past conflicts. And so my original point was to study a conflict that was over, or that was about to end, and so that I could carry out some empirical investigation in a sort of more quiet environments. The thing is that when I started getting interested in the Sahel, a new rebellion started, and it was too late. I had planned fieldwork, and I started working on another ongoing conflict that was originally rebellion happening in the north of Niger, whose belligerents were a small rebel group challenging the state. But since then, the conflict has grown. It was, in fact, even bigger in Mali and had a lot of similarities with what was happening in Mali. And since I gradually developed this sort of Sahel specialization, I also got in touch with think tanks, including the International Crisis Group, who hired me in 2012 to work on a report that they were about to release about the situation that was happening in Mali. And that is, in fact, the reason why I eventually never stopped working on the Sahel, because this experience with the International Crisis Group opened a lot of doors to me and made me realize like how complicated the situation was. And in fact, I still feel frustrated today after these many years working on this conflict, not to understand most of the ramifications of this conflict. Yeah. So I'm still hooked. I'm still riveted to what is going on there, and still willing to understand further.
So my familiarity with the conflict in the region mainly stems from UN peacekeeping, which is my area of academic expertise. And I've had a paper that I've been working on for a while, some years back now, looking at contributions to the UN peacekeeping mission in Mali. So that is really, the extent of my kind of limited knowledge of the conflict in the region. But I have to say, so looking from the outside, it seems almost impossibly complex. On the one hand, you have these kinds of suprastate actors, such as the African Union, the European Union, the UN. You've got regional actors, West African organizations. You've got sub-state actors, such as drug cartels, people traffickers, separatist insurgents, Russian mercenaries, jihadis. And then all of this is spread out across an enormous kind of region geographically, which is tremendously poor and backwards, post-colonial developing states. So given that picture, and I realize this is a challenging question, but one nonetheless, I'm curious to hear your response. Is it possible to summarize the conflict for our listeners, given all that complexity?
Yes, I can try at least. I'm not sure if this is going to be intelligible, but I think the best way to answer this question is, in fact, to look at things in a chronological manner. And if you consider the first episodes of violence happening in the Sahel, and I'm talking of Mali and Niger specifically, you could frame these episodes, these incidents, in a sort of center-periphery kind of approach. You could argue at the time that the states of Niger, the state of Mali were created after independence as fairly artificial constructs. And these situations would make some sections of the population not very happy, and particularly the nomadic populations living in the north. So classic state periphery thing in post-colonial Africa. The people that are marginalized, that live on the fringes and don't get access to the center of authority, are unhappy, they take up arms, they challenge the state. In some cases, they opt for a separatist agenda. In others, they revise their ambitions and go for decentralization or federalism. But that's one way to frame the origins of the conflict. And in 2012, when a rebellion started in Mali, that's really much how you could read what was going on. But that didn't last for very, very long, because soon after the rebellion started, which was led by separatist movements based in the north of the country, there was a coup happening in the south. And that made observers aware that, in fact, the problems were not just located in the periphery of Mali, but were also very much located in the center, in the capital. So what was originally seen as a center-periphery conflict became very much a governance crisis. And so people started looking into the past governance of this political entity that is Mali to figure out the reasons for a sort of general political decay. And so there's been a shift here that happened soon after the start of the rebellion in 2012. And because also the conflict had regional ramification, new regional actors started getting interested in what was going on. First of them was the ECOWAS, so the regional bloc, and they tried to offer solutions to what was going on that they didn't manage. And one more thing made the picture even more complicated, which is the fact that the north of Mali was also a safe haven for jihadist cells. And jihadist cells that were originally coming from Algeria, that were a byproduct of the civil war that was raging in Algeria in the 90s, that were kicked out of Algeria, and that started developing the promotion of the jihads in the central Sahel and in Mali in particular. And they did so in a very, very clever way. They preached, they established marital connections between their members and some local communities. Yeah. They also kidnapped Westerners, tourists, which they eventually released against quite a lot of money. And so that made them rich. When the state collapsed in 2012, after the kickoff of the rebellion, they were there just behind the rebels and ready also to take their share of the pie. Yeah. And this is also what attracted the attention of Western powers, of course, and France in particular, because they were portraying the Sahel as a new front of the war against terror. So you have layers of actors that eventually join the conflicts following their respective logics, right? But originally, I think that the conflict needs to be characterized first and foremost as a crisis of the post-colonial state.
So so you've mentioned the origins of the origins of the conflict in Mali with the spillover from Libya and the civil war there, and I suppose. You've kind of talked about and we're going to talk about all of these elements in a bit more detail, but how would you summarize then, I suppose, the crisis of the post-colonial state in Africa? Is it just the kind of the center periphery dynamic, or are there other significant dynamics that pertain to the question of violence? And I suppose especially interesting for us in regard to Francophone Africa.
Well, the thing is that Mali inherited a very, very vast territory at independence from the French. And in the first years of the independence, they established a socialist regime, whose power was very much concentrated in the south, and whose agenda was really to destroy the old traditional hierarchies prevailing in the northern part of the countries and also in the rural parts of the countries, and this didn't work very well because the regime didn't have the capacity to meet its promise to bring about socialism and equality among the citizens. Also, the regime was overthrown by a military power. So for many years, Mali was a dictatorship. And it was always a challenge for the successive regimes to control the north. And they used repressions against any sort of resistance to the state presence in the north. But they were never able to deploy and broadcast their administration in the most remote parts of the countries. So what they did in the 90s and in the following years was to adopt a sort of second best option. Instead of deploying the administration, they would use forces from the north loyal to the government, but for reasons that had to do with stories among northerners, hierarchies that some people wanted to subvert. So the classic strategy for the central authorities was to use some sort of divide and rule tactics, logics, to still stay on top, remind people living in the north that this territory was part of Mali and was under the control of the people in the capital. So it was never, in fact, the ambition of the state to have full control in these last years preceding the rebellion of 2012. The major ambition was to remain powerful enough to make sure that no force could eventually provoke a massive secession, right? And this is where the shock of the intervention of Libya plays an important role, in the sense that the weapons that the collapse of Gaddafi's regime made available for the actors of northern Mali represented a sort of technological shock that made the project of secessionism and separatism viable and, in fact, credible.
Yeah.
And that was the end of the story for Bamako's power. Like, they didn't have the capacity anymore to stay on top and to keep on check these armed actors that were carrying basically separatist agenda.
Yeah. So I mean, I mentioned the UN peacekeeping mission in Mali, but obviously the other aspect of it that I was familiar with was the NATO intervention in Libya and the knock-on consequences of that. And that is, as you say, the kind of an important kind of background factor to all of this. I wanted to talk a bit more about jihadism. So you mentioned the fact that the kind of jihadis were waiting in the wings with and particularly that they were enriched by virtue of kidnapping tourists. And certainly the way in which it's generally has been portrayed in the media is as kind of part of the war on terror to a greater or lesser degree. And I'm curious, I suppose, as to how much of an independent role jihadism plays, whether or not it is, because I've heard, from people involved in UN peacekeeping, I've heard kind of stories, how accurate they are, I don't know, but, I've heard about how the people that UN peacekeepers will deal with in the afternoon as kind of ordinary interlocutors or civilians will kind of don jihadi garb overnight and then attack the UN compound or attack UN personnel. And then the next day they might be kind of involved in smuggling, or they might be kind of, or don the kind of uniform of the separatists. And so that there is the sense of it being that there isn't kind of sharp ideological polarization. So I'm curious to know kind of what you make of how important jihadism is ideologically, or whether it's more as something which is kind of like an ideological trimming for religious kind of inspired separatism, or whether it's more just kind of a way to kind of cohere or motivate these people smuggling and the kind of the criminal networks that kind of flourish in the region. So how do you read the phenomenon of jihadism in this context?
Well, I firmly reject this theory that some people use, which conflates the jihadists and the smugglers. There's plenty of smuggling happening across the Sahara. The biggest actors are not the jihadists. They are in state capitals. So we have to be very, very clear about this. And and we have to, I think, debunk very firmly this idea that the jihadists don't have a political agenda. Like they are a serious political force. When they gain control of territories, they enforce the Sharia law, and you have a variety of ways of governing among them, because the local commanders also have a lot of discretion, also because you have like two different kinds of jihadist groups, the Al-Qaeda affiliated and the Islamic State affiliated jihadist groups who follow different doctrines. But if you take the case of the Al-Qaeda affiliated groups, and particularly those operating in central Mali right now, the governance that they impose on populations is not just a series of do's and don'ts. It's also deep governance of the management of resources, and including pastoral resources, access to pastoral land, competition between farmers and pastoralists. They invoke all sorts of fairly sophisticated rules to adjudicate disputes, to distribute access, to regulate taxation. And that's serious governance, which is an area where the state has been failing years after years in the pre-war situation. So we need to take this political agenda seriously, because otherwise we somehow just suggest that the state should be back and that population will be happy. But in fact, no. The kind of governance that jihadists propose is based on coercion, and they are like super strict in their use of violence. But they also meet certain demands among the population, and they carry a truly revolutionary agenda when it comes to subverting all forms of power, pre-war power. They renegotiate the role of old local elites. And if you look specifically at the taxation system that they put in place, called the zakat, it has a truly redistributive dimension. The zakat theoretically is meant to serve the poor, and they do this. They redistribute money to the poor, from the rich to the poor. And so this should not be overlooked. This is not happening in all the areas that they control, but this is an important dimension to take on board. And the fact that you invoke an affiliation with Al-Qaeda or an affiliation with the Islamic State means that you have a spectrum of action that is delineated by these affiliations. there are things you can do, things you cannot do, and the leaders of Al-Qaeda in the Middle East or the Islamic State in the Middle East also have some ways to control, suggest certain courses of action. Of course, there's plenty of autonomy also for the actors on the ground, and they can also use the Islamic jurisprudence that prevails in the Central Sahel. So they use a very complex and sophisticated set of norms to govern, and so they are not just a sort of justification for criminal activities. I completely reject this view that religion is just the veneer you place so that you can legitimize criminal actions.
So when you talk about the smugglers in the central capitals, like, or are this, I mean, are these, is this kind of state bureaucrats who are paid to look the other way, or is it that they are actually in charge of these organizations themselves?
Well, the thing is that smuggling is happening across the continent, and Mali is just one segment of much larger transnational criminal network. So the smugglers are in charge in Mali or in Niger, are in charge of one small segment of the smuggling routes. And they take a cargo at a certain point, and their role is to bring this cargo to another destination, like a few thousand kilometers away from the original point. And so they need to find their way and make sure that the cargo is protected, and so that they can make a profit. And for that purpose, they can work with anyone who can secure the convoy. So if people in the capital are the powerful guys that can turn a blind eye or even help with protecting the convoy, then they would go for people in the capital. If the convoy has to cross areas that are under the control of the jihadists, well, they might pay a tax to the jihadists for the protection of the convoy, but that does not make the jihadist smugglers themselves. Like, they might make a profit out of smuggling activities, but that's not their core business, right? And if part of the trip involves crossing areas under the control of separatist movements, then they will pay the separatist movements. So that's an entirely separate logic that still contributes to the political dynamic, to the conflict, to arms smuggling as well. But it's the logic of people who want to make money out of smuggling activities. So if you go or look at the actors with a sort of explicit political agenda, you have three types of actors: the separatists, the pro-government actors, and the jihadists. And these three options means that people on the ground can make all sorts of alliances, right? And in the middle of them, you have the smugglers, which are driven by economic interests and the perspective of realizing profits, and who also need to make some compromises with these political actors because they control a territory that matters to them. So maybe it's a simplified way of representing things, but I think this simplification can explain a lot.
Yeah. And what is the most lucrative? I mean, what are the things that are smuggled the most? What is the most lucrative items to smuggle in this part of Africa, particularly?
There's cocaine that comes from Latin America. There's that
presumably that comes into the ports
comes into the ports, that comes by air.
Right.
The routes keep changing, but yeah, the coastal areas are actually like very important. Togo, Guinea-Bissau, countries like this, are entry points. for drugs that might come from Latin America. There's plenty also coming from Morocco, so cannabis. And that follows a sort of north-south route, then west-east route, and weapons, of course. Weapons and drugs work hand in hand, because it's not necessarily money that is used or as a currency, but that could be weapons, and also in terms of technology of transportation, the most powerful Hilux Toyotas are used for weapons and drug, and then you have alternative modes of transportation for forms of smuggling that are perhaps less serious, but through trucks, and so there's a distinction that people make on the ground between the slow forms of smuggling and the very fast ones using the super powerful V8 Toyota Hilux.
Yeah. So if we kind of move on, I guess, to the to this question of the French Forever War, or the kind of the theater of the Forever War that the French have been overseeing in this region. I wanted just to talk about it from the French side, I guess, as we've touched upon the kind of dynamics internal to Mali itself or internal to the region. So if the American kind of Forever War is usually dated to 2001, with the invasion of Afghanistan in response to the terror attacks there, and then ends in 2021 with the US withdrawal from Afghanistan. And since then, obviously, the war on terror itself has become overshadowed by the invasion of Ukraine, but it's still an ongoing conflict, not least in the region itself. So the French involvement in Mali begins with the military intervention in 2014, and it's ended officially, or Operation Barkhane has ended, President Macron has ended it just on the 9th of November. It was formally drawn to an end. And so you have kind of, for perhaps half, roughly, or less than half the length of the American conflict in Afghanistan, you've had this parallel kind of theater running in Mali. And like you say, the origins can be traced back to the French and British military intervention, NATO military intervention against Gaddafi in Libya in 2010. So given all this, I wondered if you could if there are any significant differences or similarities between the French and American Forever Wars. I've spoken a bit about the kind of timelines involved, but I wonder, in terms of the dynamics of the insurgency, the dynamics of kind of the scope of the intervention by Western powers, the modalities of the intervention, any kind of important differences or similarities you think between the two kind of wings of the Forever War that are worth drawing our listeners' attention to?
Yeah, it's interesting because among the tribes in political science, I feel close bonds to the comparative politics tribe as opposed to the international relation tribe. And I've always been reluctant to sort of draw comparison between such distant theaters of operations. But after the fall of Kabul, I actually received a lot of media solicitation precisely to draw this parallel, which forced me to think more carefully about the similarities between the two interventions. And in fact, there are some. Even though the French, when they intervened in 2013, were told, look, you risk a fate similar to the Americans in Afghanistan, even though the situation was not as bad as it eventually became in Afghanistan, but there were already a lot of criticism raised against the American intervention in Afghanistan. And that's the kind of future that was predicted by a lot of observers to the French when they intervened in 2013. And I remember very, very well the French response consisting of saying, look, we have learned from the mistakes of the Americans in Afghanistan, and we know better. And we know better in several ways. First, we're operating in our former colonies, and our army has a memory of how to handle warfare and counterinsurgency in the desert. And that's a very, very interesting aspect of the whole story, which has been studied by historians and political scientists in France, like to look into the institutional memory of the French army and how colonial routines, habits have been revived in this intervention that started in 2013. So that was the first argument that the French were putting forward. We know the actors, we know the terrain, and we have plenty of experience that we can mobilize again. And then the other thing was working perhaps more closely with the local leaders and the Sahelian states, as opposed to try to go for a muscular type of state building projects. So these were, I think, the two arguments that were put forward. We know how to handle things militarily, and we are adopting a sort of light touch. We're not here for state building from the outside. We want to work in close coordination with local actors, and particularly those who have been elected in the capitals. But these two assets that the French thought they had, that were giving them an advantage compared to the US in Afghanistan, had proved completely ineffective with time. The pretension to know the actors and know how to behave militarily fell apart or was not sufficient, because you could argue that the French still militarily did a fairly effective job, in the sense that they killed a lot of jihadist leaders, but they also did some mistakes. For example, they tried to make alliances with local armed actors, non-state actors, made them auxiliaries in their fight against the terrorist groups, and that proved absolutely damaging for the local social fabric, because these groups that had been co-opted by the French perpetrated all sorts of atrocities against civilians. Yeah. So, and that's another thing that was very common during colonial conquest, right? Using proxies for counterinsurgency. They did this in 2018 at the border between Mali and Niger, and that was a nightmare for the populations. And that was eventually unplugged as a strategy. And then the other thing, consisting of working with elected leaders, elected presidents in Niger, in Mali, in Burkina Faso, didn't work that well. In the case of Mali, for example, so the French worked closely with the elected president Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta, who had personal connections with François Hollande, because they were both members of the Socialist International, so this club of socialist leaders. And Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta had credentials as a figure of the opposition. He was eventually elected after the French intervention. He signed a peace agreement with the separatist forces. He welcomed the peacekeeping missions, the MINUSMA. So it started fairly well, but it unraveled very, very quickly, because he was also a very corrupt leader, perhaps not himself, but his son, who was in charge of all sorts of military contracts, shady operations. And so the rule of Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta ended up very, very contested by the streets, and also politically and on the security front. These sorts of tactics used by the French, consisting of like killing jihadist leaders, were not stopping the jihadist expansion. So on the security front, on the political front, the French intervention proved to be a failure. And even though the end was not as spectacular as the fall of Kabul, it's not a very glorious end either, because the French were still arguably kicked out by the Malians after a coup overthrew Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta, and after the president was replaced by a junta.
So, turning a bit to French politics, there was certainly, I mean, you know, with the fall of Kabul, the inevitable kind of comparisons to the fall of Saigon, and how much of a humiliation and setback it was for Joe Biden personally and for his administration, and that it played into, you know, domestic politics, at least until the Russian invasion of Ukraine kind of, you know, changed, I suppose, the narrative. So I'm curious as to what the mood, I suppose, is like in France politically. Is it experienced as another kind of, defeat for French counterinsurgency, kind of a long chapter of France's kind of imperial expeditions in Africa that is kind of again like has again been defeated, or is it seen in a different way? Is it factoring in French internal politics at all, or is it something which has been kept separate from kind of party political competition, or, you know, is there another dimension to the way in which it's being received in France at the moment?
Well, before Macron's re-election, I was very curious to see the importance of the French military operations abroad in the presidential campaign. And well, since I spend hours every day looking at what is going on in the Sahel, I'm super biased. And I was thinking that this would have a major impact on the presidential campaign. Eventually, I really don't think it doesn't matter much what is going on in Africa for French troops deployed in Africa, for the great majority of the French opinion. I think the main risk was to have like more French soldiers killed, because the Sahel makes the news in France when some French soldiers are killed. The rest of the time, nobody ever talks about what is going on in the Sahel. And you had several episodes that could have harmed Macron, the death of French soldiers in a helicopter accident. I forgot exactly when that happened, but this created a sort of shockwave in the French opinion, but that didn't very much last for long. So this is really the kind of episodes that could have an impact among the French opinion. Otherwise, the sort of political humiliation, well, yeah, that's not making French foreign policy looking very, very good in the eyes of the French people. But I think the negative impact on Macron is still fairly limited. What I think is important to keep in mind, though, is that the Sahel was really also used by Macron as a way to impose himself and impose France as the main military leader in Europe, in the EU.
Yeah.
And so in the very last months of the French intervention, the French had tried very hard to bring on board European partners, and the French had asked them, in fact, to send special forces to work with the French in the Sahel. But this has been dismantled eventually because of the political developments in Mali. But this has served as a sort of laboratory for French military leadership in Europe. And this, according to the French military, is considered a success, France is now, and especially after Brexit, the main military protector of Europe, right, of the European Union.
Hi, listener. This is the end of the free episode. If you've enjoyed this, make sure to review the podcast and give us 5 stars. Subscribers to BungaCast have access to the second part of the interview over at patreon.com/BungaCast. If you'd like to be one of them, just sign up for $5 a month and you'll get access to this and at least 2 original episodes a month that are available to subscribers only. These include extended interviews, like this one, in-depth analyses of current events, and our ongoing critical dialogues with subscribers. That's all at patreon.com/BungaCast.